Our next speaker is Scott Taylor. He's one of the few people in Canada who specializes in observing and criticizing the affairs of the Canadian Armed Forces. He is himself an ex-soldier. He is the editor and the publisher of a very influential small magazine called Esprit de Corps. And where Romeo's theater of reference, General Dallaire's theater of reference, is Rwanda, Scott Taylor has lately been interested in Serbia and Kosovo, ex-Yugoslavia, a story we no longer hear much about. Scott, can you bring us up to date? Nice to meet you. Pleasure.
Thank you. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here. I must admit, living in Ottawa and being out of the country quite a bit, I had never heard of Idea City until I got the invitation to participate last year. And my staff found it quite amusing that I was suddenly in the category of demi-celebrity. Nobody knew quite what a demi-celebrity was, but they were certain that I wasn't one. So in the intervening 11 months, I kept hoping somehow that they were correct, because of course as it got closer and closer, I kept thinking someone's going to twig to the fact that I'm really a nobody. And the reason for that, despite the fact that I've been covering war zones for the last 12 years, I've been in the front lines, I've been under fire, I've seen atrocities committed, and I've done things which have caused people to question my sanity rather than applaud my bravery. I'm absolutely petrified of anything to do with public speaking. Now, it's not that I don't do it, I have to do it. And there was someone on one of the breaks asked me how it's going to feel to be up here rather than sitting in the back using my poison pen to criticize. Well, out of necessity of keeping my small company alive, I've had to peddle my books around the globe. I probably give 50 speeches a year. But in those forums, it's a little different than here. I mean, usually I'm the only speaker. They're very structured. They have the luxury of question and answer, which is very much requires little preparation for the individual involved. And the people coming out, it's always subject specific. For the most part, they're interested in the Balkans. They're from the Balkans. They want to hear about the party platforms of the 19 political parties that make up the democratic opposition of Serbia. They want to know about the historical battles of 600 years between the Albanians and the Serbs in Kosovo. Now, don't worry. I read the copy of Where in the hotel this morning, and in there it said that the guiding principle for the speakers in this forum is that we are not to be boring. So I'm not going to get into any of those subjects. If you need a Balkan fix, whoever's here for that reason, there is an article in the current issue of Maclean's, which I contributed to, and it's in those red packages. I noticed today, I hadn't seen it before. What was unnerving about this particular forum was that there was no structure, that they didn't sort of limit it to any one topic. And basically they're going to give us a high-profile forum, 20 minutes, and a soapbox to come out here and do a rant. Well, my staff also found that very amusing because, I mean, years ago they had coined me the Pepsi Kid. Now, I don't know how many of you remember the old Pepsi Generation commercial where that preteen would come out and he would fast forward through life to the point where he was living in Florida, wearing his pants up to here, complaining about the government full time. Well, without the fashion statement and without the weather, I had achieved that about 10 years ago. We're able to go out, complain about guys like General Dallaire full time, whether it was Somalia or whether it was corruption. So we got obviously the notoriety for being critics of the Defense Department. Now, unfortunately, Rick Mercer stole my Wrap Myself in the Flag tribute to the troops, Let's Back 'em Up theme with his video from Bosnia, so I'm not going to go there today. And of course, with General Dallaire here, I know I've seen him speak before. He's a very tough act to follow, so I'm definitely not going to be criticizing the brass today at all either. If you want Kosovo or Bosnia, you can read about it in Maclean's. Today, what I want to talk about, now that I've got the soapbox, is how the war in Iraq was sold to us and how the media basically let us down. Myself, I mean, being part of that. I was there covering the war during the buildup. So it's very personal for me, and that also allows me to get off very early on the fact that for those of you who may have criticized my work ethic, I didn't come by this beachcomber tan this early in a lousy summer without having actually earned my dues in Iraq. I've just come back from there a couple of weeks ago, so I was covering that while I was there. Most Canadians, if the polls are to be believed, did not support Canada participating in the war against Iraq. And I believe with just cause. I think that most of the world's leaders Certainly the UN didn't see just cause. Both George Bush and Tony Blair failed to make their case. The coalition of the willing which they put together certainly wasn't a big one. And during the hostilities, as the Americans started to take some casualties, the Canadians, true to our nature, we softened on the Americans. There was an awful lot of rallies supporting the Americans, supporting the men and women in uniform that were doing the job, not necessarily applauding the administration for the action that it had taken. Now, since that war has been pronounced over, despite the lawlessness and the killing and the fact that we haven't found the weapons and we haven't found Saddam Hussein, what before used to smell a little off to Canadians is now starting to really stink if they choose to examine it. So for those of us, and there was several journalists that have been there, not so many from Canada, but the ones that were there prior to the war and seeing what was happening, seeing how what was with our own eyes we witnessed was not being admitted to, or certainly was being tempered with the statements we were getting from the U.S. State Department and President Bush. I'll give an example. Last September, an awful lot of editors felt that obviously the U.S. was about to attack Iraq at some point, and they thought maybe they would choose the September 11th anniversary to launch some sort of strike. So they thought I should be there for that. So I went. I was in Iraq on September 11th. And while they didn't attack, at that point they were trying to push Iraq to accept weapons inspectors back into the country. And it was on the eve of Prime Minister Tony Blair was going to fly to Washington with his secret dossier of weapons, which he was going to reveal to the Americans at that point. Now, the Iraqi intelligence must have obviously cribbed from the same university thesis that the British did. They seemed to have all the information of what the British were going to unveil, including the satellite photograph of the supposedly rebuilt nuclear facility outside of Baghdad. Now, at the time, there was only about 12 foreign journalists in the country, and they rounded us up, and they brought about 40 Iraqi journalists, surrounded us to film us filming this alleged site that was supposed to be the scene of a nuclear weapons facility. So we went out there, and we spent hours going through every single building. We walked through the floors. This place was the one that had been hit by the Israeli Air Force in 1981, never really became fully operational, and then again was destroyed by the Americans, 81 and 91. So when we got there, there was a few areas of nuclear waste that were being guarded by a few Iraqi workers at this site. And to me, it looked like more of an environmental disaster about to happen. This place, Homer Simpson wouldn't sign off on the facility structure that was there. But as far as being a threat to the Western world, there was nothing going on. So I came back, and just by chance, there was a show on CTV Newsnet, and I got called in to do this, and they brought in somebody from the U.S. State Department, and she began explaining how, now that Tony Blair had delivered his dossier, in which he claimed that Iraq was 45 minutes from having the bomb, she was using this exact same satellite photograph as proof. So I said, well, you'll be glad to know that I've just been there, and I've walked the grounds and gone through the facility, and I can tell you there's nothing there to be afraid of. She started to actually cackle derisively on the air. And when we stopped and she went on, she said, do you think that Americans are going to be reassured by some Canadian sitting up in a studio in Ottawa who doesn't know anything? And I said, wait a minute, I just explained I've actually been there, spent hours walking through the facility. In fact, one of the British journalists who had suddenly twigged to the fact that one of the little storage huts hadn't been visited made us turn the buses around and go back to see that one last site, which of course was empty. So she said, well, do you really think we're going to give the real evidence, make the real evidence public? And I think it was Dan Matheson was the anchor. He interrupted her and said, look, you're on the verge of invading a country, and you're approved the assassination of this individual, and you're telling us that you're fabricating this the justification. And she said, look, Dan, when this is all over, once America's done what it has to do, the reasons why will become readily apparent. Now we're 2.5 months and counting, and still they failed to bring to the fore what it was they claimed they could bring immediately. Now, in January, I was back over there. I was there almost every month prior to the war. Security was tight. Everyone knew what was coming before it was happening. People talked about journalists being escorted around, not being able to see things. Well, if they were, it was to their own detriment, because actually the security wasn't that tight, and these people weren't that adept. And me and my driver weren't trying to push the system, but we, over a bottle of Arak and a bottle of whiskey, decided we would just drive north and see what happened. Of course, there's supposed to be checkpoints everywhere. We're supposed to be followed and escorted. Well, nothing happened. There was checkpoints everywhere as we drove up to the Kurdish provinces. And every time we got stopped, the soldiers either asked us for money so they could eat, or they tried to get some of their comrades to come in the car so they could go home on leave because they had no money. So we got to see an unfettered view of Saddam Hussein's vaunted army in the north. And I did a number of reports on this. This was, I mean, as a soldier, as an amateur tactician, I didn't get to be a general, seeing how they had deployed all their armor and what there was left of it and their artillery out in the open. I mean, out of their concerns, but out in the fields with no camouflage. I mean, they weren't expecting us to be there, but of course, this stuff was out in plain view. And we saw that these guys, a lot of them didn't have boots. We sat down and had lunch with some of these guys. I mean, they were generous to that extent. And they would openly talk about their experience fighting the Americans in 1991. They would talk about all their comrades that were killed, how the death came unseen. They said, I mean, it doesn't matter how brave you are, you can't fight what you can't see. These guys were demoralized. They knew what was coming, and there was no question about it. They didn't have enough trucks. These guys were driving around using dump trucks as personnel carriers. And I mean, as I witnessing all this, seeing the state that his army was in, it was worse than the Canadian forces. It suddenly made me appreciate how much equipment we do have. They would love to have some Sea Kings, by the way. So when I got back, I mean, I don't think I even got back, and I saw President Bush making some statement on the television how Saddam Hussein had deployed his troops into the cities so that he was going to hold his own people hostage and thereby create collateral damage. Well, when you know that to be patently false, it's very disturbing. It's very disillusioning that someone would actually say this. Now, we had made a trip through. I mean, it was basically a 3-day bender. We kept figuring we were going to be apprehended and sent to jail. But we saw an awful lot of things. And obviously, the Americans, they've got drones, they've got satellites. Everything would have been visible from the Americans from the sky. So they obviously knew where he had deployed his troops. But in advance of any negative press, should the Americans launch an airstrike and any collateral damage be created, they'd already built in the excuse. The Iraqi troops did not deploy into the cities at that point. On the same trip north, there was another couple of things which came to the fore for me. One was, at that point, Paul Wolfowitz was being questioned about how much the campaign was going to cost. What was the dollar figure? And people were speculating it was going to cost the Americans $95 billion to get into Iraq and to stay in Iraq. And Wolfowitz said, no, we're not going to stay in Iraq because it's going to be 6 months and we're out, because this is not like the Balkans. He said, Iraq is one people with one purpose, and that's to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And I don't know if he actually meant that or if he understood, but I mean, either way, it's rather scary, because anybody who's been into Iraq as many times as I had been, you begin to very quickly realize how many different people there are. I mean, it makes the Balkans look pretty damn unified. You've got, and I won't go into the lecture, but you've got this, Sabia people, the Yazidi, the Marsh Arabs, the Sunni, the Shia, 2 Christian factions, 2 Kurdish warlords, the Turkmens, you name it. I mean, this place, all of them going to be fighting over, if this disintegrates, over what's left, and of course the rich oil resources. Everybody knew that. You talk to the people there, they would gladly come up and explain that to you. The worst fear for the Iraqi people was going to be the civil war or the looting that would take place once law and order collapsed. So in going north, I did a number of stories on these different tribes, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Yazidi, met with these people, and then crossed up into the Kurdish area in the north, where the Kurdish Secret Service wasn't expecting us. These 2 drunks showed up at the border post, and they took us immediately to this headquarters, the massive Salahadin, the secret hideout for Masoud Barzani, one of the warlords. And we get to this place in the middle of nowhere, and it's up on this rocky cliff. And there's this brand new media center. This sign is freshly painted. There's this media center set up. And we go inside, and there's all these people waiting to see us. And they've got coffee lined up, and you want Coke, you want tea. They've got all these nice, attractive young female translators. If you want anything, you've got satellite fax, telenet, whatever. And I'm looking around, I'm thinking, at this point, this is in early February. There wasn't a single journalist in northern Iraq. Nobody was able to cross in there. So what was this all for? And the guy said, no, you're just too soon. They're all going to come. Now, we weren't part of the package deal. We were supposed to come through from Turkey with another group that was allowed in. So we were sent back to Iraq. But what we had seen was that all the preparations had been done. Everyone was waiting for the media to come in. And this was weeks before. While they were still technically negotiating whether or not they were going to miss the deadline, whether Iraq could, back out of it. And nobody from the Kurdish militia believed for a second there wouldn't be a war. I think they were out in their prediction by about 3 days from the start of the actual war at that point. So there was everyone had their plans. They were prepared for the media. And back here at home, I think you probably realize, weeks in advance of the war, the major news outlets began running ads as far as who their war team was going to be, where they're going to be stationed, whether it was in Turkey, Kuwait. They already had picked everybody. theoretically, we were still debating for a peaceful solution, but already journalists had bought their airline tickets. It was just a matter of booking the actual flight. Now, I must admit, I made my own war plan. I plan to stay inside Baghdad and cover the war from there. Now, just on the eve of war, it became apparent to the Iraqis, after someone made the allegation, that I was working for the Mossad. Now, this is something which journalists play little games on each other all the time to one-upsmanship, try to deny somebody a visa to try to keep them from getting in, or whether it's a competition can't get in. In this case, it was a very dangerous and almost deadly game. Somebody had tried to keep me from getting a visa, made the allegation, and because I had been going so many times to Iraq, I had some pull in high places. Unbeknownst to me that this allegation existed, I showed up in Baghdad on the eve of war, and of course got my visit from the Mukhabarat, the Secret Service, who told me promptly to get the hell out. So I ended up covering the war outside of Baghdad, but I ended up on the northern front. I couldn't get back through Turkey. So what I was left doing was basically providing counter-analysis to, or counter-stories to what was coming out of the embedded journalists that were rushing into Iraq with the American forces. And this proved very easy to do, having had experience inside Iraq. A number of the claims that were being made by the journalists and by the soldiers themselves, you realized that there must have been zero preparation or zero knowledge of what was the situation inside Iraq prior to them going in. You had reports when the Iraqis first began fighting back, the Americans started to capture huge numbers of young Iraqi men. And the reason they were holding them was because they were suspicious in that they didn't have shoes, but they had wads of cash. So they're putting them all into these compounds because, I mean, nobody should have wads of cash and not have shoes. Well, obviously nobody told them that after 11 years of sanctions and financial embargo, the economy in Iraq was that everybody needed wads of cash just to simply buy a cigarette. So the fact that they didn't have shoes, again, I mean, most of his soldiers didn't have shoes. It wasn't a surprise. But to the Americans and obviously the embedded journalists that went in with them, they didn't correct the story. They didn't understand what it was they were getting into. And as the war progressed, they didn't find weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqi resistance started to stiffen there for a bit. We began to hear more stories about how it seemed that Saddam Hussein was on the verge of launching his chemical weapons. And the proof of that was they kept finding abandoned warehouses full of gas suits and gas masks, or gas kits, chemical kits to test. And I'm thinking, I'm an ex-soldier. If I thought my commander, or General Dallaire, whoever at the time, was actually going to use a chemical weapon on his own people, why would I throw away my gas mask? The proof that they kept finding abandoned gas suits was less likely that he was ever going to use this chemical at the time. But they were not applying, it's not necessarily prior knowledge, but just basic logic. People don't throw away their protective gear if they think for a second Saddam Hussein would. Now, of course, he never did, and to date they still haven't found any of those chemical weapons. But it has become something which reinforced the previous allegations, was this shoddy reporting from the front lines. Now, the actual end of the war was something which, having been in Iraq and been in Baghdad so many times, was something, again, which was infuriating to see, on, I believe it was April 9th, Christine Anamapour from CNN showed up at the central location, which she claimed was the central location in Baghdad. Now, having stayed at those hotels all the time, I knew this was certainly not the center of Baghdad. That the statue that was being toppled by these people with the tanks helping to pull it over that she was witnessing and recording was in fact the sort of backwater section of downtown Baghdad, because of course with 12 years of no tourists, do you really think that these two hotels would have been in the center of Baghdad? This traffic circle was an empty traffic circle up until October the year before, when they put up one of these molded statues. This statue was one of about 20 identical. They were all over Baghdad with Saddam with his arm out. So it wasn't a central statue. It didn't mean anything to anybody outside of CNN, but it became the symbolic point at which the war seemed to end. And I can remember once CNN said that, Canadian broadcasting agencies were calling their reporters in Baghdad and saying, okay, now this seems to be the end of resistance. And the reporters are saying, well, no, this is a very few people that were involved, and there's tanks around. I mean, the Fedayeen still control most of the city. The Americans have only got a small portion of it. This really isn't the case. But it didn't matter. It was at that moment in time that CNN changed their logo from their war in Iraq to Iraq Rebuilds. And that's when everybody here, the editors started putting out the feelers saying, give us a liberation story. Now, the first liberation story, of course, was they were now free to loot. Everybody had predicted that this was going to happen. Iraqis were deathly afraid of what was going to happen from these major slums which surround Baghdad. In the breakdown of control in 1991, the Shiites had come out of Saddam City and looted the city like crazy. killing all kinds of people. This happened again. Could it have been prevented? Very easily. In fact, a lot of the looting, in going back over, you realized how orchestrated it was. They had brought a lot of the Kurdish militia down from the north, right into Baghdad in the collapse of the Saddam regime. And what they did immediately was they ran around taking all of the, what do you call it, Toyota and Nissan vehicles that had been bought under the Oil for Food program. They started to allow Saddam to buy cars, I think, in 2001. So he was buying all these sort of four-wheel drive cars, Nissans, Patrols, for his government agencies. So when the Kurds came in, they rounded them all up. They had blue license plates. They would hire Iraqis to then drive them north, pay them $200, cross the border, take them out of the country, and then sell them for a few bucks to Iranians or Afghans outside of the city. So, of course, they realized that, I mean, now the country is devoid of any new vehicles. This could have been stopped. There was one road outside of Baghdad to Soleimani where they took them out of, and, of course, nothing was done to prevent it. So you ask yourself, now that the country doesn't have any modern vehicles whatsoever, the Americans are in charge of the purse strings and the oil revenues. Do you think they're really going to buy a Nissan and Toyota next time? I mean, it's the looting that's going on, a lot of it, when you see what happens, burning of birth registries and land deeds, et cetera, was all orchestrated. I'm not saying by the Bush administration by any means, but by the people that are there, knowing what it is and what they've got a purpose in doing. So I think I'm flashing red here. I guess I got to round it up there. 2 more minutes. Okay, that's good. The last point I want to make, I don't want to preach as to whether or not the Americans should be doing what they do. That's not my job. As a journalist, my job is to bring information back, to bring it back as accurately as I can. I would expect my colleagues to do the same. If the media gives a false impression, gives false input to the public, you're going to get a false reading on public opinion, which, of course, in a true democracy is what should shape government policy. Now, I refer back to Brian Nolan. I don't know if any of you know Brian Nolan. He was a co-author on 2 of my books. He was, he's an older generation journalist. He was in Vietnam. He taught journalism at Carleton. He did all kinds of award-winning documentaries, one of which he interviewed Albert Speer in Spandau Prison after the war, just before he died. And the documentary is called The Last Nazi. Now, after they had filmed that documentary, Brian Nolan actually asked Speer, he said, was there anything that could have stopped the rise of Hitler? And Speer looked him in the eye and said, yes, a free press. And that's it. So,